Welcome to another A Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is the series, the book club series that I'm doing, serialising the late Hector Aavlos's book, Slavery, Abolitionism and the Ethics of Biblical Scholarship. The reason why this is a particularly interesting book is because it looks at how biblical scholarship approaches the issue of slavery in the Bible, rather than being an attack on the Bible itself and the claims of the Bible. It looks at how Christians and Christian apologists and theologians have warped perhaps the Bible to fit their own theological ends. So it looks at more of the treatment of the Bible by biblical scholars rather than the biblical claims itself. Having said that, this video is dealing with chapter 4 in the Bible that does deal with those sources, those biblical sources. So we are going to go through different examples from within the Bible that deal with or that mention slavery, and see how these instances in the Bible fit within the ancient Near Eastern context and how they are dealt with themselves by biblical scholars. Now, the last video we looked at the ancient Near East and the context within which the Bible was set historically and geographically, and looked at other law codes that you know talked about slavery and morality, and not only that, but the context of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and saw that really the Bible wasn't, or the claims within the Bible weren't particularly, stunningly different. And in fact, you can argue that there were better moral diktats from other contemporary sources, sort of religious and social and cultural sources. And in fact, what we're going to look at today is the biblical examples of slavery, and see whether actually they are vast improvements upon the existing laws that were around. So if you remember from the early videos, there are different ways of trying to explain away biblical slavery, and one of them is representativism, which is to say, to look, and this will be relevant for actually right at the beginning of what I'm going to say in a second, but representativism, which is, well, we've got all these different examples of this moral bad, but I'm going to say that this example here, which is the nicest example, represents the Bible as a whole, and kind of forget all these other difficult ones, or say that the peace and love talked about in the Bible over here trumps the kind of slavery and genocide and whatever over here. So there's a kind of, it's cherry picking basically, and saying that what I've cherry picked best represents the Bible and morality in the Bible, and that's a bit of a problem. Then there's trajectorialism, which is the idea that there's just a trajectory that goes towards our modern sensibilities, moral sensibilities, that slavery is bad, and the Bible and Christianity forms a necessary component in that really started the ball rolling to in this trajectory. And what Hector Aavlos shows is actually, if you are a trajectorialist and believe that the Bible's this necessary starting point, actually you're wrong, because there was stuff before that needs to be recognized. So the Bible isn't exceptional, isn't this special thing, morally speaking. It actually fits just in a road from the beginning to where we are now, and it wasn't the beginning. There was earlier stuff that actually and arguably is, as I already mentioned, morally better. And then there's reinterpretation. So the idea that, okay, this is what the Bible says, but actually what people used to think it meant isn't what it really meant, and we're right in saying it means this. Okay, so there are the three broad schools of thought that Aavlos takes a sort of a dig at, and of course, when we're dealing with what the Bible claims about slavery, it's worth noting that this is already built on the assumption or the assertion that a kind of canon is a fixed canon is correct, and in fact this is the direct word of God, indirectly written and communicated through the Bible. But this is somehow, an orthodoxy. And of course, there's disagreement there. So the Catholic canon has, I think, 7 extra books, and maybe the Protestant canon, and you got the Tanakh, which is the Jewish, Old Testament canon, and there are differences here, and who's right and who's wrong, and who's to say that these. So you get some Christians, more liberal Christians, that say, okay, the Bible isn't necessarily the inspired word of God in the fact that we should take it literally, but it is written by humans, and there's a great degree of elbow room that we have in order that we can interpret in ways that fit with their liberal moral sensibilities. And the literalists will say, actually, no, we need to take it more literally, and there's a greater degree of orthodoxy involved there, and everywhere in between. But when we're talking about evaluating biblical texts, you've got to understand that people are going to sit in very different places as far as how to approach the Bible as a whole, let alone what these particular instances say and mean. Is if you're presupposing the truth of the Bible and it's this moral perfection that sits up here, then the way that you interpret these texts will necessarily be different, because you're saying this is a morally perfect book that came directly from God in some kind of way through man, but it can't be wrong and it can't be imperfect. Therefore, we have to interpret it. We have to interpret it in this particular way. Whereas a skeptic doesn't see that at all. You say, well, there's no difference between this and the Epic of Gilgamesh, and so we're just going to interpret this in the cultural and the cultural milieu in which it is set. And I don't find it exceptional in any way, so I'm going to read it as just another historical cultural document. So it's just worth pointing that out. And then, of course, we've got you got like that's biblical hermeneutics, the way that you interpret the Bible. And then we've got lexicography. So that is a discipline devoted to establishing the meaning of words. Effectively dictionary writing in a sense, but when we're talking about words, as I'll introduce in a second, the way that you do your lexicography is really important, but of course that itself is going to be determined in many ways by where you sit on the hermeneutic front, which is like, if I presuppose the Bible is totally true and is morally perfect, then I'm going to have to interpret these words in the most generous way possible that gets God off the moral hook here. So yeah, bear that in mind. I'll read a little quote from page 62 of Aavlos, who says, one of the most frequent places where scholars mitigate biblical slavery, because remember, this is all about, and I said this in the previous video, this is all about getting God off the hook. This is all about maintaining the Bible as being morally perfect. One of the most frequent places where scholars mitigate biblical slavery is in the very words used to describe slavery. The primary word for a slave in the Hebrew, but I'm not using scare quotes, I'm literally saying, I'm communicating to you that these are like what he's put in quotation marks. So the primary word for slave in the Hebrew Bible is ebed. According to the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament, a standard reference tool, quote, ebed occurs 800 times a noun and 268 times in the specific construction of servant of God. The qual form of the verb, to serve as a slave, to work, is used 271 times in the Hebrew Bible, while the causative hipfil, to enslave, is used 8 times. And I'm going to read you a quote from that book, the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament, as quoted on page 63 here, because this is really important and shows you what theologians do to paint as benign picture as humanly possible in terms of slavery. So the quote here, and the author is Westermann, Klaus Westermann, who's an Old Testament scholar, says, in the social sphere, ebed commonly designates the slave of the Old Testament. It is not, however, a technical term in the sense of the English slave, which necessarily involves a negative preconception. So already you can see where he's going here, right? It's like, yeah, the term in the Hebrew Bible just isn't, you might think of slave and you might have these ideas of slave in the English language that you're used to now, but it's not kind of what was meant in the Hebrew use. To continue, one may never forget either that the same word can describe the officer and the minister of the king, or the nuance of the term in the self-designation, your servant. The institution of slavery predated Israel and was adopted when Israel settled in Canaan. So again, here's an attempt to get Israel off the hook, say, hey, slavery already existed. So it's not like these guys created slavery. So, they're just continuing something. It was the bad work of the people previously. So to continue again, this adoption is indicated by Israel's adaptation of the slave law of its neighbours. Israel's slave law tended toward the most humane treatment of slaves possible. Really controversial claim that. I'm going to read that again. Israel's slave law tended toward the most humane treatment of slaves possible. This tendency probably results from the fact that the slave was originally integrated into the family and was a member of the family, even cultically. And that whole quote is so worth unpicking, and in fact Aavlos does on page 63 and 64. He says Westerman is clearly exaggerating when he claims that Israelite slavery law, quote, tended toward the most humane treatment of slaves possible, end quote. What does tended toward mean? What does possible mean when we can easily imagine a more humanitarian law than the ones in the Bible? So this is me talking here. So this is where Westerman says, Israel's slave law tended towards the most humane treatment of slaves possible, as if the biblical use of slavery is literally, there is no possible better form of slavery. That's what Westerman is saying here. There is no better form of slavery. This is just outrageous apologetics. And this is exactly the sort of apologetics that Aavlos is taking aim at. And for good reason, because this is just a really obvious attempt to minimize biblical slavery and maximize biblical moral love and goodness. And it's disingenuous. Back to Aavlos. So again, what does possible mean when we can easily imagine a more humanitarian law than the ones in the Bible? For example, I can easily imagine that if beating a slave is allowed, then it is possible to not beat a slave at all. Westerman, in fact, provides no specific instances of a more humanitarian law, and the ones Westerman cites, Exodus 21, 2-11, are actually much harsher than ones we find in Mesopotamia. Speculation forms part of the evidence when Westerman claims that Israelite laws were probably more humanitarian because slaves were originally part of the family, yet slaves could be part of the family in Mesopotamia as well. The Code of Hammurabi made provisions for adopting slaves, and that's in Law 170, and he goes on to actually quote that. So Westerman is just wrong here. It's like, well, slaves as part of the family pre-existed the Bible, and we can see that in Law 170 from the Code of Hammurabi, so you're wrong. And you're also wrong by saying it's the most humanitarian slave law possible. No, because we can, it countenances beating slaves and all sorts of terrible stuff in the Bible is fully countenanced, right? And we can imagine laws that are much more humane than that, going towards the law that says you shouldn't have slaves at all, by the way. So there's a real arbitrary cutoff line for what's as humanitarian as possible. Doesn't go as far as to say that the most humanitarian law possible is to outlaw slavery, a full stop. These are human beings. These are other human beings. No. So what Klaus Westerman doing here in the Theological Lexicon of the Old Testament is completely both wrong and problematic. It's just really, I would say, disingenuous. Trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the reader. And I like Aavlos, have a real problem with that. And just to continue on page 64, Aavlos takes aim at his use of cultically here, which means kind of religious observance. So Westerman makes, this is quoting Aavlos, Westerman makes much of the fact that the slaves were integrated cultically as if that were a sign of humanitarianism. It is the opposite. Following Israel's cultic law was another indicator of submission and lack of freedom on the part of the slave. The person would no longer be free to practice his or her original religion, and death could result if slaves did not faithfully serve Yahweh, Deuteronomy 29:10-13. If freedom to worship one's God is accorded to a higher value, then clearly Israel was less humanitarian by this standard. This is really interesting. So it's the idea that Westerman, because of the bias of Christianity and therefore kind of Judaism, says, well, you know, isn't it wonderful that these slaves were made to basically become observant Jews as part of the family, and being slave, they're part of the family? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that more humanitarian? Well, actually, let's see that. I wonder if Klaus Westermann was enslaved into an Islamic cult or religion or community, right? Was actually enslaved into an Islamic community and was forced to take on Islam. Would he see that as more humanitarian? Is that as humanitarian as possible? Absolutely not. That is against the will of the slave. Not only are they, indentured, and that's arguably too polite a term, not only are they enslaved against their will and being dominated by their slave masters, but they're being made to believe something, existential. And quite how far you can make someone believe something, but you're making them partake in cultic ceremony and ritual. It begs belief that Westerman, thinks that what he's saying is reasonable. Aavlos takes a pop at another scholar, Joshua Berman, who wrote Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thoughts, a 2008 book from Oxford University Press. And Aavlos says, again, page 64, similarly, Joshua Berman's attempt to exalt the nature of biblical egalitarianism entails this claim, quote, Ebed means servant, a subordinate, an official, but does not connote ownership of the person. And back to Aavlos, yet Berman is clearly contradicted by Leviticus 25:44-46, which we study in more detail below, and we'll go on to do that ourselves. Briefly, that passage used the word abed when describing how the Israelites are allowed to buy slaves. Verse 45 states that an abed may be your property, quote, and may be inherited by the slave master's children. So not only is a slave clearly property and owned, but can be passed on, inherited by children. If buying and inheriting an abed does not connote ownership of a person, then what does? Back to me. I mean, absolutely spot on there, Aavlos. Wow. How can people write this and believe what they're writing? Like, how can Christian scholars sit there and think, I've done a good job in being honest and truthful about what the Bible is saying? I mean, that's just he's trying to square a circle there, and you just can't do it. Aavlos continues on page 65. Yes, it is true that the Hebrew word abed could sometimes designate an official. It is true that it could include the self-designation of your servant. However, that itself is no justification for saying that Israelite slavery was better. The equivalent word wadu in Mesopotamia encompasses involuntary servitude and officialdom. Thus, in a letter from Bel-Uzezib, a prophet and official of Esarhaddon, the former says, quote, I am your servant, your dog and the one who fears you. Being a dog and showing fear of the master is quite consistent with the slave status. In other words, we also see this paralleled in ancient Near Eastern texts as well. So don't think that the Hebrew Bible is special, and don't special plead the use of the word. Don't cherry pick instances of saying it can be used really benignly over here or in a self-designated way. Like you say, I'm a slave to you. Like I might say, I'm a slave to my partner in a kind of sort of positive way, right? And then say, well, look, it's been used to mean that over here. Therefore, that's what it means everywhere. So no. Come on, nuance here, and stop absolutely whitewashing parts of the Bible by taking one instance of meaning and applying it to every other instance. It's just a real problem. So now let's look at some of the actual biblical claims and instances, and it goes back really to Genesis here, Genesis 1:26. The idea of letting dominion begin. So the essential features, says Aavlos on page 65, the essential features of slavery are inequality and dominance. And the fact is that the Bible presents these features as part of the created order and from the beginning of human existence. And the quote from Genesis here is, then God said, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, plural, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over the cattle and over all of the earth and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, and created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply it and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. So it's the idea that animals submit to us, we submit to God, and there's a parallel going on there, such that hard baked into the very opening of the Bible, and thus of Judaism and Christianity and Islam is submission to God. Of course, Islam, which is an Abrahamic faith, Islam literally means submission. So, this is about submitting to God. So there is a, the dominator and the dominated as a prevalent idea. And Aavlos goes on to say, Yahweh is presented as a divine master, and Eden is a horticultural estate which needs humans to maintain it. But Yahweh, who uses trial and error, discovers that Adam cannot do this all alone, and so animals are then made to help Adam. 2:19. By the way, I love the Aavlos's use there of just saying, but Yahweh, who uses trial and error. That's a massive argument that's fascinating. The idea that he didn't have forethought. God's supposed to have the full divine foreknowledge. And again, I talk about all of these kind of arguments in my book, 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God, Heaven, Hell, Satan and Divine Design, forward by Dan Barker. So please grab that. But the idea that God wouldn't know what would go wrong or what things would be like, and so almost has to adapt reactively to the scenario. It's like, what? The whole Noah's flood has to start again because, he cocked up the design first time around and realised that actually everyone was a bit evil. Just come on. But Yahweh, who uses trial and error, discovers that Adam cannot do this all alone, and so animals are made to help Adam. The animals are inadequate as fellow slaves, and so the woman was created to help Adam. However, both were ejected from the orchard when Yahweh realised that the human beings could become godlike by eating of the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Yahweh's explicit rationale in Genesis 3:22-23 shows this, and I won't read that. You can go and look at that. But there is an order to the creation story and to Yahweh's creation that really shows these domineering relationships. And Fred Ross, who's a pro-slavery advocate. Okay, so here's one of these, Christian religious types who is like, the Bible clearly shows slavery is good and proper and fine and is countenanced and justified. We can see that example, says Fred Ross, right from the beginning. So Fred Ross said in Slavery Ordained, page 125, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. Neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. 1 Corinthians 11. He made the woman to be the weaker vessel. 1 Peter 3 and 7. I think that's what the quote's there. So in other words, subservience and hierarchy were part of God's design. And you can see that right throughout the early stages of the Bible. In fact, right throughout the Bible, even in terms of shekels, you have a monetary evaluation of man versus woman, where man is worth twice as much as woman, like in monetary terms. And so there's a kind of hierarchy of creation that we see from early Genesis. In Genesis 3:16, we have further female subjugation. So Genesis 3:16, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children, yet your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. So again, it's just like the woman gets hit by the pain of childbirth, and the man doesn't. Which, we can explain in terms of naturalistic evolution. It's not a problem. We don't have to explain things morally, okay, in evolution, in that sense. But with an all-loving God who is the perfect creator, designer and creator, then these things do need explaining. And Aavlos says on page 67, this subjugation is important to recognize because even when many theologians were willing to concede that human beings were all made equal, they would still say that this only applied to the pre-lapsarian condition, so that's before the fall, and not after the fall. And that was Augustine sort of took that view on as well. And thus in Ephesians 5:24 it says that the woman is to obey the man, quote, in all things. This is a non-negotiable. This is a non-negotiable. So there is definite subjugation within just man and woman, within general humanity. So it's understandable that slavery is going to be acceptable if you see such a difference in the sexes there, as is laid out very clearly in many places in the Bible. And then you have Genesis 9:19 to 27 and Noah's curse, and this passage takes place right after the flood, just when Noah and his family exit the ark. And you get this curious episode. Now, this is often called the curse of Ham, and it was used by sort of pro-slavery advocates to justify particularly racial segregation and slavery, and the idea that you can have ideas associated with sort of blackness and whatnot. Actually, Aavlos is quite nuanced here and says, really, the abolitionists were correct in saying that the curse of Ham, as interpreted by pro-slavery advocates, was not a correct interpretation. So I won't go through the whole Genesis 9:18 to 27 quote, but I will give you Aavlos's conclusion to this little section. He says on page 70, yet even without any original racial implications for Genesis 9, so he agrees with abolitionists, there are no racial implications. This text shows that slavery and punishment could be linked. So while there is no association between Ham and blackness in the Bible, pro-slavery advocates might plausibly conclude that God could allow the enslavement of an entire group for the misdeeds of an ancestor. The idea of imago Dei, that's made in the image of God, certainly did not prevent the enslavement of entire groups in the Bible. And in fact, I will read just the end of that Genesis 9 quote, which is, when Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his younger son had what his younger son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed be it by the Lord my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. God enlarged Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. So that's the idea of clearly allowing for the subjugation of entire peoples, the Canaanites in this case. So yeah, and we haven't even got out of Genesis yet, and there's a lot more from Genesis. So Genesis 16, we have the rape of the slave woman, which is, pretty problematic. So Genesis 16:9, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. And this is about Hagar, who was a slave woman who fled her mistress, Sarah, who was the wife of Abraham. Sarah couldn't bear children, and Abraham was allowed to impregnate Hagar as some kind of surrogate mother, and this is you kind of slave for those purposes. So Fred Ross, who was the pro-slavery advocate, remember, said that this story contains facts that stare you in the face in Hagar running away under her mistress's hard dealing with her, and yet sent back as a fugitive slave by the angel. So, and it's right. I mean, it's pretty terrible. So a slave runs away, and the angel of the Lord says, "No, you've got to go back and submit. Sorry about that. You have to go back there against your will, and you have to submit." So, and as on page 71, as Aavlos quotes Jennifer Glancy, who's writing in Early Christianity, Slavery and Women's Bodies in Beyond Slavery, says, quote, "We can trace the impact of ancient Christian toleration of sexual exploitation of slaves through interpretations of the biblical figure of Sarah and Hagar by two Christian theologians who are identified as Paul and St Ambrose, Bishop of Milan." So there's a rich history, or actually a pretty tawdry history, of, you know, sexual exploitation, slavery, justified by the Bible, and it's pretty much as simple as that. And then in Genesis 17, you know, because as if that wasn't bad enough, we've got genital mutilation. As Aavlos says on page 71, it's difficult to explain why anyone would invent such an institution that was so painful. I suggest the answer lies in its origins as a slave mark. What's he talking about? Well, circumcision. So the idea here is, why would God demand his chosen people, who he's designed to have the foreskin, why would he demand that they cut the foreskin off? What is going on there? And in fact, this is one of those kind of odd things that is so normalized in the kind of our understanding of Jewish religious law that it sometimes doesn't get questioned. But of course, the question is, certainly as an anthropologist might ask, well, why has that ended up there? What's gone on that this has happened? Why is that part of Jewish religious law? And actually, oddly enough, you'd think that we'd have a good answer for that, but we just don't. Particularly, Aavlos suggests, and I'm going to read out a quote from him, suggests that actually, as I said, it's a slave mark. So, and he says at least two features emerge from this institution. One, it is a practice commanded by Israel's Lord Yahweh, and two, it is not voluntary insofar as it is imposed on children and on slaves. Okay, so when we talked about cultic imposition of, you know, of the religious beliefs, you know, on slaves, and previous Westermen saying that this is as humanitarian as possible, the fact that a slave would be made to believe in the Jewish beliefs. Well, that's made even worse when that also includes having the skin of your penis cut off. You know, is that as humanitarian as possible? Yeah, not too sure. So Aavlos says on page 72, the hypothesis that circumcision originated as a slave mark rests on the following arguments. And this is quite interesting. I'm not saying this is 100% true, but this is as good a hypothesis as I can come up with. Well, I haven't come up with it. Aavlos is communicating that here. 1. Persons do not normally submit to such a procedure without some coercion. 2. Modification. So in other words, like when it first started, like it's a bit weird that you'd want to have the end of your penis cut off or the skin of your penis cut off. Like that's the sort of thing you'd only be made to. That would only happen if it was made to happen, as in it was some kind of punishment or some kind of like dishonourable thing. 2. Modification of the anatomy is a known method of slave marking, as indicated in Exodus 21:6. Quote, his master shall pierce his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him for life. Argument 3. A test of loyalty by a slave for a master would most naturally require an action that would otherwise be undesirable for a slave. That is to say, if a master wanted to test whether a new slave would be obedient, then the master could require the slave to mutilate himself as a test. See Genesis 34:22. And fourth, No other explanations, including supposed health benefits, have withstood scientific scrutiny. So in other words, there is no other good reason, like even theologically so, as to why circumcision is a thing and why it is a thing in that particular part of the world and for those people, and a good thing and a thing that people would want and would want voluntarily. So therefore, the best understanding would be that originally it was a mark of slavery, and the people out of which Yahweh belief and religion came would have originally possibly been a slave community, or, you know, slavery was an important part of their heritage or something. You know, I don't want to go back to Exodus because that would mess things up, because that's not what I'm saying, actually. But certainly, well, I mean, you could explain that there might have been small numbers of people enslaved. As we know, a few Canaanites were enslaved in literally on very, very small terms in Egypt. So, you know, there might be some interesting parallels there. Genesis 17:23, and again, we're not even out of Genesis. Abraham, the blessed slave master. So a fundamental passage for pro-slavery advocates can be found scattered throughout antebellum pro-slavery literature. So this is in the American South when they were justifying slavery. Genesis 17:23 says, "Then Abraham took Ishmael, his son, and all the slaves born in the house, or bought with his money, every male among the men of Abraham's house, and he circumcised the flesh of their foreskins every day, as God had said to him." Fred Ross, the pro-slavery writer, suggests that this shows that slaveholding did not prevent God from blessing Abraham in all things. Genesis 24:1. This is super important. Remember, this is God. Like, there's no way around this. This is God saying, one, slavery is okay because, you know, I'm either telling you to do it directly or like congratulating you for doing it or whatever, and that forced circumcision is okay, and that this whole scenario is okay. Ownership of other people is okay, according to God, here in Genesis 17. So, you know, abolitionists, people who claim that, you know, that Christianity and the Bible is just this necessary opening salvo in slavery abolition. It's just nonsense. It's just nonsense, because you have Yahweh, you have God very clearly effectively defending or even ordering slavery and genital mutilation, and slaves being returned to their masters and mistresses so that they can be impregnated. Exodus 1-15, a liberationist paradigm, asks Hector Aavlos. Aavlos says, these chapters on page 73, these chapters contain what many modern scholars see as the paradigmatic abolitionist and liberatory narrative of the entire Bible. The exodus of the Israelites from an oppressive Egyptian slavery is taken as a principal evidence of the liberatory orientation of biblical ideology. This is the idea that Exodus, let my people go, Moses freeing the enslaved people, the Hebrews, and getting them out of Egypt. This is obviously abolitionist, right? But actually, no, not. Let's be a little bit more cute about this. So Aavlos says on page 73, the wider scope of the Exodus narrative shows that slavery is not only legitimate, but divinely sanctioned. Yahweh himself is viewed as the slave master of the Hebrews. See Leviticus 25:55, which says, "For to me the people of Israel are servants. They are my servants, whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Thus, the intent of the narrative cannot be seen as a manifesto for abolition in general. And Aavlos continues, second, the use of the Exodus as a paradigm of liberation betrays the religiocentric nature of these modern biblical scholars and theologians. Seeing the Exodus as a paradigm of liberation relies on representativist hermeneutic that we already critiqued as arbitrary. That's that cherry picking one I talked about at the beginning and in a previous video. The idea that this verse or this chapter or this excerpt from the Bible represents biblical morality, and these ones that seem to contradict that don't. But it's rather arbitrary that I can just pick this one and forget those. Why aren't those representativist, a representation of the Bible better than this one? And it's because you're just trying to pick out from the Bible what you want it to say. As Aavlos goes on talking about a particular scholar, Cone, for instance, does not seem interested in the subsequent enslavement of the Canaanites. He does not explain why that enslavement of the Canaanites ought to be seen as the paradigm of biblical ideology. I'll continue in a second, but this is really, really important. So if the Exodus accounts represents how the Bible is so liberationist, so abolitionist about slavery, then why is it that the Hebrews come straight out of slavery in Egypt and enslave the Canaanites? Why is that not a representation of what the Exodus story is all about? Don't just go, oh look, this is all about getting out of slavery over there and being liberated, because it's saying that Jewish people shouldn't be in slavery, but they should enslave others, or they have a full right to enslave others. It's really problematic. So this approach that these Exodus accounts are liberatory is not right. Aavlos continues on page 74. The Hebrews are later to eradicate the Canaanites and or enslave them. Thus the Exodus story in its larger scope is more a story of group privileging, wherein a particular group is entitled to liberation but not others, e.g. the Canaanites. The group privileging rationale is analogous to the rationale used in New World slavery, wherein one group, white Europeans, felt entitled to liberty, but this did not mean that they felt liberty was owed to others. Viewed in this light, modern scholars who see the Exodus as a paradigm of liberation only betray a Judeo-Christian bias, because they do not seem to consider the consequences of Hebrew liberation for the Canaanites. And it obviously goes on. I'm only picking particular quotes, but just absolutely spot on. It's so problematic. Anyone who uses the Exodus as an example of liberation and abolition just needs to get their head checked. So Exodus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 5:12-15, and the Sabbath. So usually numbered as the fourth commandment of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. The Sabbath directive appears in the Covenant Code, Exodus 20:10 and Deuteronomy 5:12-15, as follows. And it goes on. I won't read it all, actually, because I'll just read you the key bits, which is, in it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, or your manservant, or your maidservant, or your ox, or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the sojourner who is within your gates, that your manservant and your maidservant may rest as well as you. So here, in the Ten Commandments, we have got, and the Covenant Code, we have got God directly saying you should observe the Sabbath, and this should also apply to your manservants and maidservants. Well, wonderful. But you're not saying, by the way, you shouldn't have manservants and maidservants. No. Oh, you got manservants and maidservants. Job's a good one. Just make sure they rest on the Sabbath as well. Oh, that's nice. That's really humane. Again, is this, as Westerman would say, as humanitarian as possible? Oh, they're saying they can rest on one day of the week. That's nice. Oh, but not saying that you shouldn't have slaves at all. Oh no, okay. And just throwing them in amongst, your ox and your ass and your cattle. Yeah, there you go. And this is where, again, this is a representativist and trajectorialist approach, which is say, oh, look at this, is wonderful, they're getting this, isn't that biblically exceptional, and saying, look, this is better than that which was already around, and it's a necessary march towards complete abolition. I'll tell you what would have been a better march towards complete abolition, which is God saying straight there and then in one of the commandments, don't keep slaves. End of business. That's it. Job done. But Aavlos on page 75 says, nonetheless, Harrelson, another Christian apologist and scholar, applauds how the day of rest brought about remarkable social changes. It's the idea that the Bible, the Hebrew Bible here, is bringing about these great social changes. Slaves, this is great. Slaves can have a day off. Whoop-de-woo, But again, as I've said, yeah, but they're still slaves, aren't they? Yeah, I can think of a slightly better social change there involving outlawing slavery. But of course, when you inherit a book like the Bible, the Hebrew Bible in this case particularly, when you inherit this book, there's nothing you can do about getting rid of it. When you've canonized it and saying this is the revelation of God, then all you can do is attempt to make it sound as good as possible, because really you want to edit loads of it out there, as was it Thomas Paine? No. Well, frankly, I don't know, one of the founding fathers or whoever, cut out all the bad bits of the Bible and the miracles and whatnot, is left with not a lot. But I'm probably bastardizing that. But the idea is that if you receive this book, you are duty bound to make it as morally benign as possible, which means that these are the tactics you have to do. I mean, I understand why Christian scholars do this. I empathise with them. I would just not be a Christian scholar, because the book is obviously morally reprehensible. As strong as that, is morally reprehensible. So I couldn't live with myself. I can understand why you would want to make it sound as good as possible, because you have to be a Christian. If you want to be a Christian, then you've got to do that, because otherwise you're a Christian that accepts that your revelatory book is morally reprehensible. Those two things can't mix. So something's got to go. It's the morally reprehensible bit. So you've got to make the book look as good as possible. But for someone like myself, I'm not duty bound to do that. So I'll look at the book for what it is and say it's morally reprehensible. And that's one of the many reasons I'm not a Christian. So there you go. Anyway, I've not finished chapter 4. There are a bunch more biblical excerpts to go through and examples of slavery, but I want to make this video manageable, and it's approaching 50 minutes now, so sorry about that. But this is the book club. Hopefully you really enjoy what I'm telling you and the Aavlos's book, and go out and buy it yourself and read through it and pore over the footnotes and the claims, and I am only picking out, I'm doing my own cherry picking of the key parts, but I'm not changing the meaning of what Aavlos is saying. I am merely trying to present to you a succinct a synopsis of what he is saying as possible. So yeah, anyway, please like, subscribe, share, and do all the usual YouTubey stuff. Thank you for watching, and I will get on and prepare myself for the last part of this chapter before moving on through the book. Please put your comments below. Take care until next time. Question everything, particularly yourselves.